around the world.
From Kabul in Afghanistan, from Amman, Jordan, from Banda Aceh,
Brian
Indonesia.
Williams and NBC Nightly News, where the world unfolds nightly.
From NBC News in Washington, this is Meet the Press with David Gregory.
This Sunday, war and peace.
To be honest, I do not feel that I deserve to be in the company of so many of the transformative figures who've been honored by this prize.
President Obama unexpectedly wins the Nobel Peace Prize, even as he tries to craft a new strategy to win the war in Afghanistan, now entering its 9th year. Is the centerpiece of Obama's foreign policy mission impossible? This morning, an exclusive debate on the way forward and whether the Taliban and Al-Qaeda can ever truly be defeated. Two key voices on the Hill and two experienced military leaders weigh in. Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Democratic Senator Carl Levin of Michigan. A GOP member of that same committee, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. Former Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Southern Command, retired General Barry McCaffrey, and former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, retired General Richard Myers. Then the political debate. Will the president be able to get his own party's support when he finally presents his plan for Afghanistan? When will we see some agreement on health care? And what more should the White House do to create jobs? Insights and analysis from our political roundtable. The National Journal's Ron Brownstein, the Wall Street Journal's Paul Gigot, BBC World News America's Katty Kay, and the Washington Post's Bob Woodward. NBC Television presents Finally, our Meet the Press Minute from February 4th, 1968. Some very important lessons from another war that didn't go as planned.
But first, the debate about the way forward in Afghanistan. Joining me now, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin, and the Republican from South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham, as well as retired generals Richard Myers and Barry McCaffrey. Great to have all of you here for such an important discussion. So here's where we are. On the president's desk, a request for more troops, up to 40,000 troops from his general on the ground, General McChrystal. The president has said in Afghanistan it is a war of necessity. In March, he said there was a massive counterinsurgency strategy. That was the strategy. So Senator Levin, if his commander comes to him and says, I need more forces, why isn't the answer yes?
The answer is that the President of the United States has got to look at all aspects of this. Obviously, a commander's recommendation is important. It'll be given great weight, I have no doubt about that, and it should be given great weight. But so also should the recommendation of a Secretary of Defense, who is the choice of the President to be in that position, and the President has to.
We're back with our Meet the Press Minute. In the early hours of January 31st, 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive, a massive and deadly attack against more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, catching U.S. forces off guard. U.S. troops recovered quickly, though, and managed to deliver a military defeat to the Viet Cong. Still, the incident became a public relations and political defeat for the Johnson administration, fueling the anti-war movement back home. It also marked the height of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The man who would become known as the key architect of that war, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, had already announced his impending resignation months earlier. In a rare interview, he appeared here on Meet the Press just 4 days after the Tet Offensive and made the stark admission that the war had not gone as planned.
Looking back over this long conflict, and especially in this rather agonized week in Vietnam, if we had to do it all over again, would you make any major changes in our approach?
This is not an appropriate time for me to be talking of changes with hindsight. There's no question but what 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, the historians will find actions that might have been done differently. I'm sure they will. As a matter of fact, my wife pointed out to me the other day 4 lines from T.S. Eliot that answer your question. Eliot said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Now that applies to Vietnam. I'm learning more and more about Vietnam every day. There's no question I see better today than I did 3 years ago or 5 years ago what might have been done there.
Are you
on balance, On balance, I feel much the way the Asian leaders do. I think the action that this government has followed, the policies it's followed, the objectives it's had in Vietnam are wise. I don't, by any means, suggest that we haven't made mistakes over the many, many years that we've been pursuing those objectives.
You seem to suggest that we really didn't, that none of us appreciated what we were really getting into.
I don't think any of us predicted 7 years ago or 15 years ago the deployment of 500,000 men to Vietnam. I know I didn't.
1 month later, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, requested an additional 206,000 troops from President Johnson. That request was denied as the administration began a reassessment of the policy and ultimately an effort to de-escalate the war. Still, the last U.S. military unit would not leave Vietnam until March of 1973. All told, the U.S. lost more than 58,000 troops during the war. We'll talk more about the parallels between Vietnam and Afghanistan and hear from Bob Woodward about his 2007 interview with Robert McNamara, his last interview on record before his death, where McNamara goes further than ever before about the mismanagement of the Vietnam War. We'll post that conversation later today in our Meet the Press Take 2 Web Extra on our website. Plus, look for updates from me throughout the week. It's all at mtp.msnbc.com. And we'll be right back. Before we go today, a couple of programming notes. Tonight, tune into the premiere of our chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel's Tip of the Spear, a 1-hour special documentary on the lives of soldiers on the front lines of the war in Afghanistan. That's tonight at MSNBC at 8 p.m. Eastern. And next Sunday, right here on Meet the Press, we kick off NBC's special week-long series, A Woman's Nation, and we'll feature a special conversation with the First Lady of California and the project's guest editor, Maria Shriver. You'll also want to watch the surging Los Angeles Dodgers in the National League Championship Series. That's all for today. We'll be back next week. If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.